Hello and welcome to Cannabis Marketing Live. I'm your host, Kendra Losi, and I am so excited today. I know I say that a lot, but I have been asked more times recently about influencer marketing, and so today we have Christine here from Friend of a Friend PR, and she is going to share all of the secrets with us. So, if you have been wondering how to get all of those influencers that you see talking about CBD or cannabis marketing products, and you see the brands, the buzz around the brands increasing, and you want to know how to capture that for yourself, you're in luck. We are going to be covering all of that today. So, welcome, Christine. How are you doing today?
Doing well. It's such a pleasure being here, Kendra. Thank you so much for having me on.
Of course, I'm really excited to talk to you about this. I know that, first of all, you guys watching, drop any questions you have in the comments. We'll be keeping an eye on those. And secondly, every time Christine and I talk, it's at least like what, an hour. We get
Absolutely.
so excited talking about all the different things and how to help brands create more buzz. So, Christine, as we're getting started, can you tell us a little bit about how you got started and what is Friend of a Friend PR?
Absolutely. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Christine, and I've spent the majority of my 20 plus years on the agency side, primarily working on PR efforts within larger integrated marketing communication agencies. And 3 years ago, I launched Friend of a Friend PR. We primarily focus in brand storytelling, primarily media relations, and I would also say brand and influencer partnerships. And when Kendra and I first met, I had shared a story that really had worked in influencer marketing before that term was even a term. So about 15 years ago, I had worked with a large CPG company that anyone would recognize. And we had partnered with one of the larger bloggers at the time, Pioneer Woman in the space. And through our efforts, it was incredible to see the amount of traffic she drove to the website, the amount of people that she would drive to a conference she was attending. And so we realized very quickly that if we found the right partners, we truly could tell our story in so many different ways. And so since then, there hasn't been a campaign or a project that I worked on that didn't have an influencer or advocacy type program. And so I'm excited to share some of my tips and tricks with you today. About $22 billion is expected to be spent in this space within the next year. So it's a little bit like the Wild Wild West, but with a few tips, any brand can get started.
Oh my gosh, I was actually just reading an article today about like the TikTok houses and the clubhouses that are being created for content marketers and influencers over the past few years. Just the growth of how people are using influencers, what they can do, and how it's changing the dynamics of marketing, I think is a really important topic. But before we start talking about all the different things, you mentioned something that I think is really important to level set,
Mm-hmm.
and that is bright, shiny objects. I know I'm guilty of it. I think a lot of people watching are guilty of it. Can you talk a little bit about what you see with your clients and bright, shiny, when it comes to bright, shiny objects?
Of course, we actually call it the BSO syndrome just because it does happen quite a bit and it happens to the best of us. There's new platforms being introduced each, it seems like each week there's new tools within certain platforms that get introduced regularly. So ultimately, what it comes down to, where we try to provide guardrails for our clients, it comes down to like three different things is what are we trying to achieve? Knowing your objectives. Is it broader awareness? Is it a product launch? Is it an advocacy type program? What type of influencer type program are we looking to create? So that would be the first piece. Having a very clear idea about who your target audience is and what platform they engage on is likely the most crucial when it comes to helping avoid bright shiny object. A lot of times we can be biased about, if Instagram is your preferred platform, you may want a lot of the programs that a brand is working on to be on that platform. But if your target audience ultimately isn't on that platform and it truly is LinkedIn, then that's a platform you need to prioritize. So I would say those two pieces would be the easiest ways to help provide the guardrails for setting up a program and trying to avoid the bright shiny objects.
So what you're saying is that if your audience is on LinkedIn, don't bother trying to create a TikTok clubhouse and learning dances.
There are very creative ways of having different things come to life. That may be something that you want to try at some other point. But I would say too that you would also be surprised at, there's always pilot programs or test and learn programs. You would be surprised at how some traditionally stayed topics can really come to life very creatively. So if you do partner with someone that does, some things really creatively, who knows, a dance might be the best way of showcasing it.
Well, and it's always fascinating to me how, and I'm just going to talk about LinkedIn for 1 second because everyone thinks of it as very like staid and boring and buttoned up and so corporate. But I've seen people like Goldie Chan like just do amazing things on LinkedIn. Creativity, like she has green hair, right? Like she stands out on LinkedIn and she was able to use that to really become one of the top influencers for LinkedIn. And it's an open market there because no one's really paying attention to it. Okay, I'm going to put my soapbox over here.
I like your soapbox. You can put it anywhere you want.
And get back to influencer marketing. So if I, say I had a brand and I know the guardrails that you talked about, right? Like I know who my audience is, I know what platform they're on, and I've set up goals. Well, let me back up. As we look to set up goals, what type of goals are realistic to expect from a influencer marketing campaign?
Of course, I would say that generally influencer marketing advocacy type programs are really great for the top of the funnel type programs for so anyone familiar with marketing, that broader awareness, whether or not it's a service or product launch, etc. So I would say that any platform has their typical engagement metrics. So making sure that you're very clear in terms of whatever the deliverable is, that those metrics are being captured. So for instance, since so much money is being spent on Instagram, I think about 70% of influencer marketing is spent on that platform, that, measuring everything from engagement rates to story completion rates to the swipe ups. If you're tracking to Amazon, making sure that there's a link to track all that piece. So the thing is, even though it's broader awareness, there are true metrics that you can use to help showcase what is being done on behalf of the influencer. And if it is a successful partnership, you will see positive metrics.
And that's really important because it's one of those things where I have friends that have ended up in influencer type contracts, and all of a sudden the brand is looking at them to be their sales team. Right? And that's not necessarily a realistic, right? Like the influencer marketing people and the influencers you hire, for the most part, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's not going to be like the Kardashians, right? Like you're not going to have an influencer promote it and then your sales are just going to jump into the millions of dollars, unless, depending on who you get. But more realistically, like you said, it's creating that buzz, creating that awareness. But there are different types of goals and metrics to use, right?
Of course. And you've absolutely hit the nail on the head. If a brand ever reaches out and they want to do an influencer advocacy type program, but that's where they're spending the vast majority of their dollars, I, in good faith, and truly no agency in good faith, should truly take that dollar amount and use it for influencer marketing. There should be a lot of other things in play, paid efforts, SEO, paid social, etc. Just because there truly does need to be a holistic approach. Influencer marketing is absolutely powerful, which is why you see it, but that is just one piece in the larger marketing.
It's so funny, like when I was doing, running a larger marketing strategy, it was very much, and we were using influencers at the time, but they weren't called influencers. But it was very much the like, okay, what levers do we need to move, or dials, right? Like, what dials do we need to move the needle, and which ones are going to create more awareness to, like you said, that top of the funnel where people get to know who we are, versus what's actually going to help people purchase and make that decision. And there's so many things that go into it. And a lot of times people are like, oh, here's the magic. It's paid ads. Or here's the magic. It's influencers. Not realizing just how many times someone has to see the message before they actually pay attention.
I am nodding my head vigorously because I cannot agree with you more.
It's the whole bobblehead interview. You're like, yes, you're amazing. No, you're amazing. So who are the influencers?
That is a great question. And that's honestly where a lot of our programs, start with is, influencing the influencers. So it truly is $1 million question. So depending on the budget or what we're trying to do, would say that typically we will set up programs in a couple different tiers. So you have the influencers who are great with the broad awareness. So those are little, I would say, categorized more in the celeb or macro category. But then you have influencers in the nano and micro influencer categories that are incredibly powerful in terms of actually creating that action for their followers. A lot of them have their own niche, etc. So I would say that, when setting up the program is really looking at the best partners to influence, but then, since a lot of people have their own platform, I mean, truly, you're an influencer, Kendra. Almost anyone listening, to this program is too. You think about the last time you took someone's recommendation for the new restaurant you wanted to check out because you heard that they had a fabulous dish. We are all influencers our own different ways. So you want to find the people that truly do um, influence those people. So I would say bottom line, set up with a couple of different tiers of influencers to really kind of help with the reach, but then also to help drive that engagement.
What you said was really important, right? Because a lot of times I think when people go into looking at influencer marketing, they're looking at the celebs. They're looking
Mm-hmm.
at, in cannabis space, they're looking at Snoop Dogg or Seth Rogen. Like, I can't tell you how many clients have come to me and said, this is who I want. Like, that's great. The line's over here. The dollars are up there.
Mm-hmm.
Like, but you don't have to use influencers at that scale. Sorry,
Correct.
there
And
wasn't really a
no,
question
and we're actually
there.
no, and we're actually seeing higher engagement numbers with the nano and micro influencers, just given that because they have a smaller audience, they technically, or a lot of them really do know their niche even better. Like when you have the Seth Rogans, the Snoop Dogg's, and Martha Stewarts of the world, they are not only getting the cannabis or CBD folks, but they're also getting more lifestyle or music or whatever it is. Where a lot of, if you focus on CBD cannabis specific influencers, that really is what a lot of their content is. So we do find their numbers overall to be even better than some of the macro or celeb level influencers.
Can you define what is the difference between a nano and a micro influencer?
That's a great question. I feel like we just love throwing all these industry specific terms. So I'd say, like, generally accepted terms, the celeb level, you would have like 1 million to, the hundreds of millions. When you think of the Kardashians, etc., that level, Chrissy Teigen's, the macro influencers would be in the 100 to 500,000 in that area, a micro to 10,000 to 100,000, and then anything below would be nano. So those are some generally accepted industry benchmarks.
Perfect. Thank you. I think that's important to realize because for a lot of CBD business owners, depending on you know your revenue, you're going to be looking at the nano and micro influencers because those are the ones that have a more to what you've been saying, Christine, is that they have that interested niche already, so they're
Mm-hmm.
probably going to be, even though their audience is smaller, it's probably a higher percentage of your target audience within that niche. Um,
Absolutely.
is there anything? I know we didn't talk about this, so bear with me. But what would you say are the most common mistakes you see companies making that want to get into influencer marketing?
Say, it does go back to chasing the bright, shiny object. So, they heard, their kid mention, you know, TikTok or, joining in a group on Clubhouse, etc. And they decide that, that's the thing that they should be doing, even though that's not where the target audience of the brand that or product, is engaging on. So I would say that, just listening to non-data fact advice is something that we have run into that we provide counsel on, putting in all dollars into influencer marketing, which we already covered, choosing influencers for the wrong reasons. I would say that, one of the first things that we'll do after we define the objectives of the program, all the information that you would cover in a brief, we'll identify the key criteria for any of the influencer partners. So any influencer that we recommend would meet the filter of all those criteria. But sometimes people, they see someone that they engage with or that they think are in the category would be a great influencer without doing the research to see like, a lot of their followers aren't real followers, or they're posting too much. People may seem a little bit thrown or maybe dissuade just because they're posting too much, etc. And so just making sure that they're doing their due diligence in finding the right partners for them. Those three things would be the top things that we run into in terms of the don'ts.
It's so important. I want to back into one. I want to just spend some time on one of those details because when you mentioned the criteria, one of them that I've personally found that I probably wouldn't have realized it was as important is understanding the values of the organization, but also the values of the influencer. And one of the things that, so quick story time, when I was managing the marketing for a university, right? Like I had all the different, like I said, all the dials that we were managing, and we pulled in some influencers, and one of those, they were radio station, like morning DJs, across California. And the ones in one of the markets, I went to one of their events and they started talking about, oh, thanks to thanks to our partners, and anytime we need money we call them and they give us money. And that was like the complete opposite of what this altruistic nonprofit that I worked for wanted to have, like, be known for. So, like, obviously it created a lot of tension and frustration, and they eventually got fired from the partnership because they did it not once, but twice after they were told not to. But it just was like they were looking at the dollars while we were looking at making us more approachable. We had very different goals, and they had no problem, like, joking around about it, which wasn't the tone either. So I think that when you mention the criteria, you really, if you're not working with an agency, if you're trying to do this yourself, or if you even are working with an agency, making sure that they understand that what that criteria is and what's important to your company, because otherwise you're going to get mismatched with people who might be, talking about one CBD product one day, a different one another day, and there's no reliability and trust built there too.
Absolutely. I mean, authenticity gets thrown around way too much these days, but it truly does, that word does mean a lot in terms of influencer advocacy type programs. We've all seen that type of content where a person or influencer looks like they say yes to every single brand partnership that comes along, and it really dilutes what they're trying to say just because that they're being paid to say it. And when you have a smart partnership with someone who genuinely believes in your product or service, has mentioned it, before in a genuine way, it just comes off so much more genuine, and people have that inherent trust. So you bring up an excellent point there. And it is something where, influencer marketing is, we always look into data, but there is that human element where you do need to be very picky about who you partner with. So it does take a human to actually filter that type of trustworthiness when you're, going against the criteria that you've laid for the program.
Absolutely. Like, I think that making sure you're picking the right influencers, and then what have you seen in terms of, like, working with them over time or versus just like a one-time thing? Like, what have you seen be more successful? And I realize that that's a tough question because it involves looking at the goals and taking other things into account. But can you talk a little bit about, like, the duration or the frequency of what you have influencers do?
Of course, in an ideal scenario, a longer term relationship benefits both the brand and the influencer because it just truly shows an actual relationship between the brand, the brand solutions that it offers to an influencer's audience. And it just comes off much more genuine. If you see someone talk about the same brand over and over again, there's a genuine affinity. Not to say that if it's a one-off project or pilot program that it comes off as disingenuous, but it really does benefit both the brand and influencers. And we've heard from both sides that that's ideally what they both look for. That said, there is, more budget needed for those type of programs. So we can talk about pilot programs or test and learn programs too, but I would say, like, in setting up a longer term relationship with influencer partners, and for this scenario, I'll just assume that these are already influencers that are doing great work for your brand. Typically what we'll do is, if we look at a calendar or fiscal year, we'll figure out those key timeframes for that brand that makes the most sense for its product or services to come to life. So if it's the holidays, if it's back to school, if whatever those key timeframes are, we would work with our influencer partners to create content around those timeframes, and then tease it up before, etc. So that's ideally how we would do a more ongoing program. And we always would love, in most scenarios, so right now, sometimes still virtual, but if you are doing a longer term partnership, it's always great to get the influencers with, like, in person with the actual brand. So bringing them to your headquarters, having them meet with your key decision makers, etc., because it truly just even adds more of that relationship to the partnership.
You said something that I think is really interesting, and this is where I want to break it down even farther for a second. So, there's a couple different types of influencers, right? You see, like, the simple, or sorry, let me rephrase. There's several different types of, like, building these relationships. Sometimes there's just, like, the affiliate link, like, okay, yeah, here's my favorite product, use this. Then there's the actual influencer partnerships, like what you're talking about. And then it's almost like the brand ambassadors, right? They're integral to your business and you want to see them involved. Like, I have friends that get involved with pre launches of new products who are like helping tease that out because they're excited that they get to this information, they get to share this with their audience first. So I know that there's a lot of different ways that you work with influencers. Where do you recommend people start? So if I have a company and I want to add it into my marketing on that, chain, basically, along that path, where do you recommend people start?
Start with planning an influencer program.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that ideally, to have, when you are in that planning process, whether or not it's for the coming year, coming quarter, to incorporate it at the beginning or as soon as the beginning as possible, and working with your agency partner or yourself, just to see how the other elements are coming to life. Because, if content is being created by the influencer, that can be leveraged on the brand's owned, earned, and paid, shared channels. There's just more collaborativeness, I feel like, when you involve that element of the program at the beginning. So that's an ideal scenario. That's not to say that, if the program's already there, then you can't, or if you don't do that, you won't have a successful program, but that's where we've seen most success.
I also think it's important that it's for brands to remember, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, and feel free to jump in with this too, is that I think it's really important that you're hiring the influencer because they're an expert at their niche and their audience likes them. So I've seen brands that take and impose the rules, right? Like, here's what we need you to say, here's the exact script at minute, if you're doing a video, it's at 32.5 seconds, you need to put this on the screen, like, to the point where it's just ridiculously dictating every piece of it. How have you seen that versus letting the influencer do what they do best and incorporating the brand?
Of course, yeah, no one wants a prescriptive experience. The influencer absolutely does not want that experience, just because, Kendra, you just hit it on the head. They know what engages their audience the most, and they're just the best at terms of, creating that content. And so what we'll do in a best practices scenario, it will always generate what we call an influencer brief. And the type of information that we'll include in the brief are, information about the brand, what we hope to accomplish, ideally how it would play out on the priority platforms, the different brand channels, what the call to action is, the do's and don'ts of the brand. And I would say those are more of like the brand mandatories, that, the brand guidelines that we'll share with them. But quite honestly, the guidelines are really just guidelines. So what we'll do is we'll share it with the influencer and tell them, based on what we're trying to achieve, how do you best see this come to life, or what would be most engaging for your followers? And it's amazing how creative they are and what they come back. It's, there are things that we would never think about. Or, they might have an appearance on their local like TV station coming up, or a key conference that they're going to be speaking at, and they can authentically weave in your product or messaging, in there. So it's always great to kind of like set it up as more of a conversation instead of, here is your, 30-second whatever you say. And, anybody following you or listening to that, they can tell right away if it's an ad, and you're not going to get any engagement from that.
It's just so amazing when I see, like, I do a lot of research on TikTok. And as seeing like the people who are gaining the followers start incorporating brand messages into some of their feed, it is fascinating to watch. Some do it really well, and some I'm like, oof, somebody needs to help you out, sweetie, because that's not okay. But it's just so interesting to see how creative people will get when they're looking at it differently than you are as the brand.
No, absolutely. And, especially with TikTok likely to get more dollars in the future, from influencer spend, it's always something to, it's always good to interact with the platform just to see, what is working and what isn't working. But absolutely, they truly know. I mean, the ones who are good at it are the ones who know how to seamlessly do that, and also know when to say no to partnerships that don't make sense. I think that's, whenever, Kendra, we've spoken about this when we work with influencers, that's one of the biggest piece of advice that we give is, don't say yes to everything, because that just dilutes your brand. You truly have to think long term if you're doing this for a potential full-time job, is who are truly, the brands that you want to work with. And how a metaphor that we've used is, if you were a brand, or if you're an influencer and, a brand, like, could you authentically be seen talking to each other at a party? If not, it's probably best just to, find another partner.
Oh, that's a really good one. That is a good analogy or metaphor. Um, so you've worked with companies in the CBD space with setting up influencer programs. Was there anything unique to CBD that people had to pay more attention to in terms of, besides the, like, you can't make claims and some of the nuances around the wording? Was there anything unique to the CBD space, that you thought worked really well or that was successful that you can talk about?
Absolutely. I would say that the education, when the program that you're talking about, Kendra, was probably about a year and a half ago. So it was, a lot more information has come out, since then. But at that point, like, the biggest barrier that we were coming, especially to the target audience, was truly the education piece. A lot of people still thought that, there was significant portions of, THC within the CBD. And so there was a lot of education in terms of the benefits of CBD, what it can do, what it can't do. So that's what we focused a lot of the programming around. So I would still say, there's still education, because, there's always,
It's still there.
you know,
It's still a need.
myths out there. But that would be, I would say, like, one area within the CBD space um, that we would still probably recommend to do a little bit of work on, especially for things that could help really differentiate your brand.
Absolutely. Education is still needed. There's so much misinformation out there
Mm-hmm.
that we don't want to let go of that. But it's interesting that you noticed better results when there was more education focused. And that, it's just so fascinating to me. Like, when I look it up on whether it's YouTube videos or Instagram, like, seeing how people are using CBD and using influencers. And once
Mm-hmm.
again, same with everything else. You've probably seen the same, as I've seen some done really well and some like
Yes.
um go ahead.
Oh no, I know it's gonna, like, there are a couple. I mean, clearly there's a lot of money within the space, and you see what works and what doesn't. And I would say that, going back to the question before that you asked, Kendra, about longer term partnerships and the efficacy of those, I would say when it comes to the CBD space, the influencers that I've seen partner with brands over time seem to have a lot more action, just based on, what they're asking people to do and based on the results that they've shared. So would definitely recommend, if any of the brands listening today have a little bit of budget and flexibility to allow for longer term partnerships, that would be beneficial.
Fantastic. Thank you for that and those insights. I have one more question, and this isn't going to be as well. I lied. I have more questions than that. But one more question that I want to make sure we talk about is I've seen contracts really help a business as well as the influencers when something happened. How do you recommend? What do you recommend? Are there any key points in the contracts that you recommend people include? Is there a good place to get those contracts? Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, that's part of the partnership
Mm-hmm.
or the relationship?
To quote Brene Brown, I would say that being clear is kind, being unclear is unkind. So will not be a program I will ever work on or recommend working on without a contract. And that's really to protect both parties. I always say that surprises are great for life moments like birthdays and anniversaries. No one wants to be surprised with things that they didn't ask for in terms of a partnership or for work. So making sure that any of the deliverables are clearly outlined, down to the day, how many stories you're asking for in in a series, what that swipe up should be. That's pretty standard. But other things to consider, making sure that FTT disclosures are always followed. Just to cover the brand, making sure that no other brands in the competitive space are featured in a post. You'd be surprised sometimes when that comes up. So everything just needs to be clearly defined. Another thing that we'll also put down in the contract is that for any content that's being created for any priority platform, it needs to live in perpetuity, as long as that platform exists for that influencer. And we've been lucky, that hasn't happened to us, but there have been instances where, influencers will scrub their feed because they're looking for a different aesthetic or, changing things up. And then all of a sudden, all that great content that you created is now lost. And so those are just some of the smaller things that we'll also just put in there just to protect ourselves.
I hadn't even thought about about how long content is staying on there. That's so interesting. And I've seen contracts blow up, right? Like, oh, something happened where the brand didn't align with the influencer, so the influencers were letting it go and wanted to leave, and that's where like the contract wasn't as clear, or it was and I've also seen it like super clean. Here's what the contract says. You want out either side, great, Tiger Woods, we're done with you. Whatever it is, whatever the size of it, it's important to make sure that you have all of that clearly defined. So thank you for sharing those notes, because I was taking notes as well. There were some really great tips.
Of course.
So as we're getting ready to wrap up, there's a few other things that I think are really important. Okay. First, let's talk about where people can reach you.
Absolutely. You can find me on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram at Friend of a Friend PR. And that is also the name of the website. So Friend of a Friend PR. And I would love to hear from you.
Thank you. Normally I do a speed round where I ask people a bunch of questions, and I'm not going to do that to you today. But one question I will ask you is there any media, like books, podcasts, video series, anything that you've been watching or reading lately that you think is just like, oh my gosh, this was so fantastic, that you'd recommend?
Oh, within the influencer marketing space or beyond?
Beyond is fine.
We do have a life outside of influencer marketing.
Exactly. We don't need to talk limits right now.
I would say, well, I think I start every single day listening to the daily and up first, just so I know what the big topics are going on in the world. But I would say from a pure entertainment standpoint, I just finished the third season of Shrill on Hulu,
Ooh.
featuring A.D. Bryant, and it is just a lovely ride with great characters and just well written. So, highly recommend that.
I'm on season 2 right now. It was recommended to me, and all of a sudden I was like, how did I get to season 2 already? Um, yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think that I like how you combine it um, with understanding what's going on in the world each day. But I feel like pop culture is something that's often overlooked. Like, I know I joke
Mhm.
around about having a timer on my phone to only keep me on TikTok for an hour, but there's so many things that pop up that I'm like, okay, this is what people are talking about. This is what people are paying attention to. And it gets overlooked so often that when you're trying to, in the name of like, oh, here's my business books, here's this, here's this tidbit and gem that I learned. But that's not always the case because you have to be able to combine it with what people are really talking about in the real world. You can learn all of, and this is coming from a marketing professor, right? Like, you can learn all the things, but if you don't know what's relevant and what's popular, your learning all the things is going to be totally outdated quickly.
I couldn't do it better myself.
Absolutely. So, Christine, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to have you and all of the great tips that you shared with everybody. Those of you watching, Christine and I have a couple things in the works too that we've been talking about that we're teasing out a little bit around influencer marketing for CBD businesses. So, stay tuned for that because there's some exciting stuff coming out. And thank you for watching. Christine, thank you so much for being here. Everyone, have a great rest of your day. Once again, I'm Kendra Losey with Moda Marketing, and here is where you can reach us.